Right, hello everybody, and welcome to Ancient Modern. Tonight we have a very special guest who is Mario Trabucco della Torretta. So welcome to Ancient Modern, Mario.
Hello, James. Thank you for having me.
And I thought we'd just start by maybe instead of me introducing you, you could just tell the viewers about your background in archaeology.
Yes, so I have been studying archaeology for best part of 15 years. Initially in Palermo, then University of Palermo in Sicily, also moving between Palermo and Agrigento, and then I went to the Italian Archaeological School in Athens. And then I had my doctorate in archaeological and historical science at the University of Messina. During these years, I've been working on architectural terracottas. I've been working on marketways and economy of Athens, and I've been working on ancient fortifications. The interest for the Parthenon is fairly recent. I started looking into some of these things when I wrote my article on the Hephaestion, and so in order to assess the chronology of the Hephaestion before or after the Parthenon, and
Maybe
then,
we should just explain if people
as
don't know that the Hephaestion is the very well preserved temple in the Agora, on the little hill in the Agora, which people used to think was the temple of Theseus, and actually the local
yeah,
area is still called the Theseo.
the
But of course now we're entirely sure that it's actually the temple of Hephaestus. But sorry, yeah,
yeah.
go on.
So in a couple of years ago, basically, what happened was that my hometown's museum, the Archaeological Museum Antonino Salinas of Palermo, decided to do an unprecedented, at least for Sicily, gesture and agree a long-term loan of the only fragment of the Parthenon we had in that museum. The so-called Fagan fragment. This fragment is a very tiny fragment. It's like 35 centimeters tall, no more than that, and it contains the foot of Aphrodite from the East Frieze. And this fragment most probably has been given by Elgin to Robert Fagan, who was then Consul General of Britain in Sicily. And at the death of Robert Fagan, it passed to his wife. His wife sold it to the University of Palermo, and then from there it ended up being in the Archaeological Museum, what was back then the National Museum in Sicily. And then it's been there for 200 years, and there was absolutely no reason to move it. Yes, obviously it was not particularly informative, being only just one fragment, but still it was the sign of a relationship between Sicily and the Parthenon, between Robert Fagan, the English consul, and the archaeological scene back in Sicily in the early 1800s. It was very active collector. So it was telling a story. They have decided, Caterina Greco, the director of the Archaeological Museum, decided to make a little bit more of a political gesture, and decided to initiate what they call the repatriation of these pieces to the Acropolis Museum in Athens. The Greeks obviously were jumping up and down from joy, and it was obviously widely publicized. Caterina Greco and the cabinet member of the Sicilian regional government for culture went to Athens. There was a big ceremony with President Premier Mitsotakis as well. So it was something big. It was big because it was the second restitution. The first one had been in 2006, I think. It was the Heidelberg fragment, which back then Professor Kaniotis, Angelos Kaniotis, was vice chancellor of Heidelberg University, decided to kind of donate to the Acropolis Museum. So it was something very big, even if the fragment was very, very small. I was not particularly happy with this. And so I started writing on newspapers, and I started writing articles. And from these, the thing got momentum in itself. And now I'm in the UK, one of the few people, sometimes I've been defined a fringe figure that decides to actually take the part of the British Museum in the Elgin controversy.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, as I already told you, I think when I wrote my article for Quillette, I actually moved slightly towards the restitutionalist position because of my interpretation of the ferment, and we'll come to that. But I am slightly troubled by the fact that it seems to be one of these debates, like so many nowadays, where really there's only one side, and it's very difficult to hear the other side of the argument, which is partly why I wanted to have you on. So let's just work through the debate now. You've already mentioned, actually, I'll note in passing, one interesting thing that actually I think not everybody knows about, which is that London, the British Museum in London, they're not the only place where there are bits of the Parthenon sculptures, right? You've already mentioned Heidelberg, you mentioned, well, used to be one in Palermo, and Copenhagen and Paris as well, right? Anywhere else?
Yes.
And also the Louvre.
There is Vienna as well. Yeah,
Where's that, sorry?
Vienna has a little fragment as well.
Okay.
Vienna,
okay. All right,
yes.
So yeah, I just wanted to note that, but sorry, did you want to add something?
Yeah, the Paris case is particularly striking because they have quite a significant collection of Parthenon fragments, because they have one whole slab of the frieze, they have a metope, they have one of the heads of one of the pediments, so they have a significant collection, and yet they are never mentioned in restitution claims. But the most extraordinary thing is that at least part of this collection they have in the Louvre is the documented product of theft from the French consul, Louis Fauvel, that admits in letters to the French ambassador and to the foreign minister of France that he basically got them in an illegitimate way. So the astonishing thing for me is that the Greeks are not pursuing a claim for the repatriation of the French fragments that have been acquired illegitimately, and instead they vehemently pursue the repatriation of the Elgin marbles, whose acquisition is entirely legitimate and way more straightforward than the acquisition of the French fragment ever was.
Okay, well, let's talk through the acquisition of the Elgin marbles by Elgin then. So maybe you could just take us to Athens at the beginning of the 19th century and talk us through that. How did Elgin come to acquire the marbles?
So Athens in the year 1800 was a very small place. It was just a backwater town of 10,000, 15,000 inhabitants, with the Ottoman garrison patrolling the area from the fortress on the Parthenon, so on the Acropolis, sorry, and it was having a significant stream of Western travelers, obviously. First of all, because there had been a deviation of the flux of travelers that used to go in southern Italy and Sicily, but could not anymore because of the Napoleonic Wars. Southern Italy had been occupied by France. Sicily was basically a military base of its own, and because of these, all these Grand Tour flux of travelers was moving to the Balkans instead, and Asia Minor. Many travelers went there. So as soon as Lord Elgin was proposed, apparently by George III himself, to go into Constantinople to be His Majesty's ambassador extraordinaire, then what happens was he thought, okay, that's an opportunity to actually profit from these travel, profit scientifically from this travel, because his architect, Thomas Harrison, told him, we don't have enough details about the architectural beauties and the monument of Athens. Of course, there have been Stuart and Revet going there with the Society of the Dilettanti expedition. They published the very ponderous 4 volumes but this was but an appetizer in a way, and that's why obviously he said, no, I can do better. It tried interesting the government, it tried interesting learned societies. They couldn't or wouldn't give him any money for it. Obviously, there was a war going on, so there was a reason for this. Elgin, undeterred, said, you know what, I think this is important to improve the taste of the arts in Britain, and so I'll finance it myself, doesn't matter. He assembled a team, and then Lucieri himself got the rest of the team, another 5 people, between draftsmen, painters, architects, etc. And they went all the way to Athens in the year 1800. This was the beginning of this documenting mission. The purpose of the mission initially was entirely benign. It was just to document, just to take sketches, to take measurements, and to take molds of all the sculpture of the famous monuments of Athens. And they started doing precisely that. Elgin himself obviously was far too busy in Constantinople, being ambassador, and the international situation at this particular moment was in a way favorable to Britain, because the French started going into war with the Ottomans, and they had taken Egypt, which was a province of the Ottoman Empire, just in the same way as Greece was. The Ottomans had an alliance with the British. The British helped them reconquer Egypt by defeating the French fleet at Abu Qir in the Battle of the Nile, and so obviously they were in a way very friendly with each other. Elgin, as any aristocrat of the time, was a passionate collector, so he, even in the travels towards Constantinople, he was assembling a collection. One famous bit is the famous Sagion inscription, and but there are also other pieces, sculpted marbles, not only inscriptions, but anything that was in a way curiosity coming from the ancient world. He was very friendly with Ottoman officials, especially the Capudan Pasha, the admiral of the fleet, and these got him permissions here and there to get particular pieces. For some pieces, he had to resort to the permission of the Sultan himself, for example, because a particular the so-called Constantine sarcophagus was inside the mosque, so obviously could not be removed from the mosque because it was a religious site without the explicit permission of the Sultan in his quality of supreme chief of the Muslim religion in the Ottoman Empire. And he got these. So we are in a framework where acquisition from foreign visitors of antiquities is something that is quite routine, and in particular, the particular case of Elgin, this was not a strange thing that he was doing, just going on the Acropolis and getting pieces, because he had it several times before, and he would continue doing it so even after his ambassadorial post in Constantinople. Then in the beginning, obviously, there was a problem for the artists going on the Acropolis itself, because it was a military base. So obviously, it's not exactly a site where you can just waltz in and say, I'll take this, this, and this, thank you very much. Even for entering, there was the need for a permission, and this permission was initially granted by the commander of the garrison that is there for a fee of 5 guineas a day. An astounding sum, let's say £500 a day for all the artists. And then obviously once the situation became unsustainable, frankly, because of the costs involved, what happens? Elgin petitioned the Ottoman government asking for a more explicit permission, saying, okay, can we just get in, do our drawings, to take our molds and make all the measurements that we are wanting to do. The initial permission was sent to Athens, but never reached Athens for strange reasons. We don't particularly know why. There is a suspicion that the British consul, who was a Greek, was not particularly happy, and so ran interference, but this is not a fact that is 100% proven. So Philip Hunt, Reverend Philip Hunt, who was the personal secretary of Lord Elgin, said, okay, let's call for another firman. And that's where we have the pivotal point, because what was initially an expedition to document the monuments becomes an expedition to save and rescue the monuments. Let's take one step back. We are in a period where obviously they know the history of these monuments because of all the studies, the depiction by Leroy, the expedition by Jacob Spon, the volumes by Stuart and Revet, and all these other travelers that came before. And all of them have documented the Acropolis, have documented the state of the sculptures. And by going through these volumes that everybody in England had ready access to, they can see that the Acropolis was perishing. In each one of these volumes, you can see less pieces attached on the Acropolis by the day. And this was a situation because obviously of natural calamities, problems with war and war damage. The most eminent of which obviously is the 1687 explosion that destroyed basically the Parthenon. And but there was also human intervention, because obviously all of these foreign travelers wanted to take a piece. They wanted the souvenir. And the Ottomans, especially the members of the Ottoman garrisons, were quite happy to detach pieces and just sell them on the black market. So as soon as Elgin's men came in, they saw the Acropolis and they saw the state the Parthenon was actually rapidly going into, by comparing with the pictures that they had seen, and even the molds, for example, that the French consul had done for Well. There is an example, for example, in the British Museum. There is a part of the North Frieze where you can see that there are two adjoining slabs, and on these two adjoining slabs you can see that there is one figure of one of the Gerontes that is leaning on a stick that has been completely chiseled out. Now, that figure, we know exactly what it was, because 3 years before, Louis Fauvel had taken a cast of it. So we have the plastic representation of things that basically can change from one year to another. We have figures on the friezes and in the pediments and all the sculptures on the metopes that 1 year they are there, the year after they are not. So Hunt and Lucieri were painfully aware of the situation, and they started saying, we need to do something, because if we don't do something, two things can happen. One is in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, there's not going to be any more sculptural decoration to think about. Or even in the worst case scenario, these are things that are basically prisoner of a culture that doesn't value them, doesn't care about them, doesn't take any steps to prevent this decay from going on. And so there is a memorandum written by Philip Hunt that says that's what we want to ask for. We want the ability to put our scaffoldings on, to take molds and casts. We want the ability to roam freely in the Acropolis. And we want the ability to take away pieces of stones with figures and inscriptions. Now, this memorandum was approved by Elgin. Elgin went through the dragoman of the port, the chief translator of the British embassy in Constantinople. They went to and they got a firman. They got this permission, and this permission is mirroring one-to-one exactly the memorandum that has been delivered by Hunt. It's actually quite more ample in a way, because of the way granting permissions in Ottoman lands works. The idea is there is kind of a two-stage process. The first stage is from central government. They give a permission that is the spirit of the permission. It's quite vague, because at the second stage, it empowers the local officials, in this case, the chief judge and the commander of the garrison, and the local governor, the voivode. It empowers them on the ground to basically make all the little adjustments and interpret the spirit of the permission by just guarding on the ground and nothing happens against it, but also kind of tweaking the scope, making it more strict or more ample according to local elements. The central government obviously cannot possibly know with precision, and that's why there is this kind of two-tier element. The language of the Ferman, which, as you know, we don't have in Turkish original, because it was sent to the voivode, and it would have probably been kept in the archive of the voivode on the ground in Athens itself, and these archives have been destroyed during the Greek Revolution. Then it's preserved in the Italian translation. Why did Hunt get an Italian translation? Because he wanted to be sure of what was the precise letter of this firman, which were his rights, in a way. What was he empowered to do? Because this permission obviously was quite ample, and he wanted to be sure to profit to the full extent from it. And this is exactly why he got the translation. Why in Italian? Because Italian was the lingua franca in the whole of the Levant at the time. And also because we must not forget the equipe of the team of sculptors, decorators, molders, etc., that came with Elgin. They were all Italians. So they were really interested in getting a precise idea of what they could do, what they could ask the local governor to do, and what they could not, what was not included in a way. Based on this permission, Hunt returns to Athens, accompanied by a mubashir. This is an imperial messenger.
Can I just, Mario, this is all really good. Can I just ask you some questions about the firman? Because
Sure.
this is the bit where, when I was writing the article, I looked up the firman, and I'd heard from the side that wants to keep the marbles in the British Museum that the firman was very clear, and it clearly gives Elgin permission for what he did, which was to take sculptures, I think both from the ground and from the Parthenon itself, right? Some of the metopes were taken, some of the metopes were taken from the temple itself. And when I actually looked at the actual firman, the actual document, both in Italian and in English, I was a little bit shocked because, as you say, it seems to focus on this sort of artistic study, right? It's a lot about taking molds and line paste of the ornaments and visible figures, measuring the remains of other ruined buildings, undertaking to excavate according to need the foundations to find any inscribed blocks, which may have been preserved in the rubble. So that he's giving permission for that. And also, no one meddle with their scaffolding and their implements, which they may have made there. And should they wish, this is the crucial bit, should they wish to take away any pieces of stone with old inscriptions and figures, that no opposition be made to that. So I suppose that reading that in context, it seems like the emphasis is on artistic study. And then there's this passage about rubble and foundations. And then they say, are there any pieces of stone with old inscriptions and figures, almost as an afterthought? So I'm thinking that the permission is really just to study these things, take molds, and then maybe if there's some epigraphists, they're interested in inscriptions, they can take away, a single stone that's on the ground already. And maybe some of these will have relief sculptures or something, so they can take that. If you're right that Hunt and Elgin were thinking for a long time ahead of this, that they really actually wanted to save the sculptures from the Parthenon itself, from the temple, even though the system of permission in the Ottoman Empire was sort of informal, why didn't they make it more explicit? At least that would have made it easier to settle this dispute, right? Why didn't they make it absolutely crystal clear in the firman?
At the end of the day, it is crystal clear in the firman because the firman is laid down in the most general terms possible. And whenever they say at the end of the clause, basically, they say, and whatever they do, they basically get all these inscriptions, stones with figures, etc. If they want to take any, they can just do it, so and no opposition be made to that. This is kind of the culmination of all the permissions that have been given, and these permissions, they go from like the smallest possible, entering the Acropolis, to then operate freely in the Acropolis, and then to put scaffolding, so other additional elements, and then take the gas, and then they go up and up and up and up to the topmost permission, in a way, that is right at the end, that is to take away. So there is a logic progression in the way the permission is given. And I'll tell you more. The permission reaches Athens on the 22nd of July, 1801, and there is a little bit of negotiation phase with the Cadi and the chief judge and the voivode, and then they need to go to the Disdar, the commander of the Acropolis, with this further approval to enact the permission. The first metopies, we know that they have been taken either on or before the 31st of July, because Lusieri or Hunt, I don't remember which one in this particular moment, tells Elgin in a letter of the 31st. So we know that they started with the metopies. That's exactly the first thing that they do. So now if you have a permission, and this permission sets out quite clearly what you are about to do, and there is, let's say, a wonky area. Would you start from the wonky area? Would you start from the gray area? Or would you start from the things that you're empowered to do straight away? What they do demonstrates that they were, all the actors on the area, they were fully aware of what the permission entailed. They were fully aware that taking pieces of stones with figures from anywhere on the fortress was actually something that was perfectly legitimate and perfectly included in the permission. It's not an afterthought. Otherwise, if it had been only an addendum, these and if the addendum had been in a way the gray area, then this would not have been what they started from. They would have been the last thing that they did. Once they had taken away everything else, while they had completed the work that they wanted to do, once they had completed the scientific artistic part, then we say, okay, yes, let's come to the last part of the firman. And yet they start exactly from the first one. So obviously,
I believe as well that those metopes, the only contemporary painting or depiction that we have of Elgin removing objects or artifacts from the Acropolis actually have him or his men taking down one of the metopes, which, if people don't know, are these kind of blocks of sort of blank stone with sculpture on it, go between the two triglyphs, which are sort of three-line things above the columns themselves. Anyway, it's a feature of the outer Doric part of the Parthenon. So, I mean, that painting as well kind of suggests to me, I suppose, that if they had wanted to stop what was going on, if the authorities had wanted to stop what was going on, not only is he doing it in public, but it's being painted by people, they would have stopped it. And this has become an increasingly important argument for the British Museum, right? That there's a kind of implicit consent in the way that the Ottoman authorities reacted. What do you make of the argument, though, that Elgin was actually just bribing them all?
It's a slanderous accusation, in my particular opinion. This has been most recently taken again up by Catherine Titi in a recent book on the Parthenon marble dispute. And she basically was perusing Elgin's accounts to Mr. Long, the clerk of the UK Parliament, whenever they were negotiating for the acquisition of the sculptures by the nation. And Elgin was obviously giving a little bit of an account of his expenses and why was he asking for £75,000 as the price for the sculptures, saying this is not only for the sculpture themselves, but actually to compensate my expenses, which have been considerable in the name of the nation. Not really in the name of the nation, because he acquired the things in his personal capacity, but why was he doing it? To benefit the nation. So his argument was, I'm doing this for England, and I want my expenses compensated. And my expenses were blah, 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 blah. There is a voice in there that basically says 21,900, etc. P, there is the letter P, it doesn't say bribes, but basically says contributions towards the authorities in Athens. Now, this contribution, Catherine Titi jumps on it and says, these are the bribes. We exactly know even how much money this was. And this amount of money is £21,900, and is corresponding to 2.552 million pounds of this day. Now, the problem we have with these is twofold. One, the P is actually not for pounds, it's for piastres. And piastres are the Ottoman currency at the time, which is basically in the pounds. 1 pound buys 16 piastres. So now we have an amount that is no longer £21,900, but it's actually £1,300. Now, these £1,300 actually refers to a period between 1803 and 1812. Now, this 1803-1812 period is way after the marbles have been taken. These marbles have been taken during the years 1801 and 1802. Now, would you bribe on an installment plan and start bribing for something that you have done in the past? Or do you give the bribe before you do something? So this is entirely unsustainable in terms of the logic of the bribe. First of all, it's not a bribe, because obviously if you scale down this amount during the long period, we are talking about £100 a year, and these £100 a year basically is less than 1/3 of a pound per day. Now, what kind of bribe is that? For when they were asking for 5 guineas a day to just enter the Acropolis, then they accept 1/3 of a pound a day, which is something infinitely smaller, to get everything in it. That's entirely unsustainable. So these are not bribes. These are the small gratuities that are typical in a place like the Ottoman Empire, just to get to see people, just to get this paper just to go smoother and quicker wherever it's supposed to go. It's not something to obtain something that is not due. It's just the oil that greases the Ottoman bureaucratic machine. And we have plenty of examples of that. There are travelers that basically say, if you don't pay here and there, you're basically not getting anything done. You don't even get to see the officials, because they all exercise a level of discretionality, and this level of discretionality is a way of profiting, in a way. It's a way of rounding up the salary. But we are talking about small change here, not bribes.
Okay.
And, there is no way that you can just discard this historical evidence and say, hey, no, he was bribing the officials quite clearly. Where? How? How do you say that?
Okay, so Elgin has this document, he has this firman, and he's sort of greasing the wheels, shall we say, of this process by handing out these gratuities, and he's taken, I think, something like 60% of the ionic frieze that goes around the outside of the inner part of the temple. Is that right? Something like that?
Yes, more or
And
less,
he's taken a few of the metopes only, and he's also taken things which aren't on the Parthenon, right? Like one of the caryatids in the Erechtheion, which is next door. So one of the female sculptures who sort of holds up the entablature of part of that temple. Okay, and he takes all that, and let's pick up the narrative now. So he ships that to London. It's a little bit complicated, but let's just go straight to London. And what I want to skip to is actually the process whereby the Select Committee of Parliament then looked at the legality of this and what they decided.
Yes, so obviously the idea of selling the sculptures to the British Museum is not something that was particularly new, because they were purchased in 1816 only. So basically 10 years after Elgin had actually re-entered the country in 1806 after a little bit of exile as well, because it's been taken prisoner by the French for 3 years. But there was already talk in 1806. We have records from the Speaker of the House of Commons that had spoken to the principal librarian of the British Museum in order to acquire the sculptures. So this negotiation is something that lasts for 10 years in a way, with ups and downs and agreements and disagreements. So at the very last step of this negotiation, since after 10 years of the sculptures being in this country and having excited the imagination of the public one way or another, for and against, more preponderantly for in terms of the opinions of the artists and the opinion of the general public. What happens was there were doubts, there were voices, there were points that needed clarification before the acquisition could actually go smoothly. So what the Speaker of the House suggested, Elgin, was you make a petition to the House of Lords for petitioning Parliament to actually look into it properly with the Commission. So, and again, Elgin does that. He presents a petition, so the Parliamentary Commission happens because of Elgin's own volition, and the points that the Parliamentary Commission, the Select Committee, is supposed to look into are mainly three. One is, are they worth it? Should we acquire them? Are they actually objects of prime artistic value that are really worth the money and they are worth to get into the British Museum? Second of all was how were they acquired? Was the acquisition legitimate? And third point was, if the acquisition was legitimate, was it done in a personal capacity by Elgin, or was he acting as an ambassador of the crown? Therefore, whatever he has acquired is already ours, they were saying in Parliament. Therefore, we shouldn't be paying anything for it. So they were trying to have them in a way lightly. So all these 3 points are fully scrutinized. The artistic merit obviously becomes very clear because all the artists, Benjamin West, the president of the Royal Academy, Antonio Canova, there were Ennio Quirino Visconti, there were all these chief giants of the arts in Britain and abroad that were saying these are masterpieces, you should not skip the opportunity to get them. And the only person that was actually opposed to that was Richard Payne Knight, which was the leader of the Dilettante Society back then, which had snubbed Elgin all along. There is an anecdote actually of Richard Payne Knight saying directly to Elgin at the dinner party, "You've lost your labors, sir, because these statues are not Greek originals; they are actually Romans." So he had not understood anything at all about these statues. He thought they were Roman copies, second and third rate. Therefore, they were not worth the money. And he was hell bent in preventing these from happening. But obviously, the artistic merit is quite easy to understand by anyone who even glances over the marbles. And the prevalent opinion is actually that they should be purchased. Then it happens also that they look into the acquisition and they find it entirely legal. There is they interview Hamilton, the Elgin secretary, when he was in post at the embassy. Then they interview Reverend Hunt. They interview all these figures that basically were they interview Elgin himself, obviously, and all of them they tell how this was acquired, what was the negotiation about. Hunt actually says, I have also a letter that basically says what was the permission, because this theme of the permission was specifically asked to Elgin, and Elgin couldn't produce one. He said, no, obviously the permission has been given to the authority. And so it gets asked to the other witnesses, and whenever it comes to Hunt, says, I don't have it here, but I have a copy of the permission, and I will give it to you. And that's why the English translation of the Italian translation of the Furman gets into the papers of the Select Committee in the appendix at the end, whenever they make their report to Parliament. So all this gets clarified as well. The acquisition has been deemed legitimate. And then the third point, was he acting on a private capacity as a private individual? Yes, obviously this gets discussed as well, and they see that there was no mandate for, it was not part of his brief as an ambassador to get these acquisitions done, and that he was acting with his own money, with his own of his own accord, as part of his own private activity of acquiring souvenirs of the place, as any other traveler at the time was doing. So all these 3 points get clarified. The Select Committee presents a report. The report gets to Parliament, and Parliament votes in 1816, 80 votes against 32. So we are not talking about a 50-50 decision or something like the Brexit referendum that could have gone either way. There is an overwhelming majority of the members of Parliament that vote on that particular act of Parliament to purchase the sculptures, 80 against 32. And therefore, Parliament votes and they say, yes, okay, we are going to pay, they estimate only £35,000 because of other collections that have been purchased at the time, the Townley marbles being the most notorious of them. And then, because obviously we need to think about the year, it's 1816. We have been coming out of 20 years of French Revolutionary Wars and the war against Napoleon. It's not like cash is flowing freely as in peacetime. They've been just paying for the Battle of Waterloo, to make just one example. So the state is strapped for cash, but they see the opportunity. They see it's worth doing it. Therefore, they decree to pay basically not the expenses, but just culture. At that point, after this very prolonged negotiation, Elgin is in a way strapped for cash, and this has been going on for so long, and he just gives up and says, okay, yes, just give me £35,000. We'll settle on that, we'll shake and be done with it. And Parliament then decides that the collection should be vested in the trustees of the British Museum. Therefore, it is the property of the British nation, but is being entrusted to them for care. And there is also the provision that they need to be called the Elgin collection. So it's described in law. So whenever we talk about Elgin marbles, in this country at least, we are actually following the law. We are not doing any particular ideological construct. On the other side, it's an ideological construct to call them Parthenon marbles or Parthenon sculptures when this particular subset of Parthenon sculptures is called Elgin collection, Elgin marbles.
Yeah, well, see, my uses of those terms are that I use the term Parthenon marbles to refer to all the marbles that were originally on the Parthenon, and the Elgin marbles, I use that term to refer to the subset of Parthenon marbles that Elgin took out of the country.
Exactly. And then, so since then, they basically are in the British Museum. They get translated from Burlington House, where they were sitting back at that particular time, to the British Museum, and they've been there ever since.
Okay, let's. This is great, but maybe we should speed up a bit, just because there's so much to cover. But so that's great. So we've gone in detail into the sort of acquisition process, and this is obviously a big part of the argument, whether they were essentially stolen, as Kyriakos Mitsotakis, the Greek Prime Minister, said the other day, or whether they were legitimately acquired. But of course, it's not the only part of this debate. So maybe we've only got about 20 minutes left, but in what remains, let's talk a little bit about these other features of the argument. So one of the big debates is around preservation. Obviously, the British Museum side says we saved these marbles, we preserved them much better than they would have been preserved in Athens. The Greek side says pretty much the opposite. They would have been fine in Athens. There's this fantastic new Acropolis, still pretty new Acropolis Museum in Athens. They'll have a very good home here. So what's your understanding of how well the Elgin marbles have fared in London, and how that compares to how well the other Parthenon marbles, which have been left in Athens, have fared?
It's a very contentious point, and basically people have been fighting over this and spent lots and lots of pages, written lots of pages on one sense or another. Now we have scientific proof. Through the work of Emma Payne and the last recent article by Ferry and his equipe, that basically demonstrated that the so-called damage to the marble that was caused by an incident during the 30s, just before the Second World War, when people employed by Lord Duveen, who had given a substantial amount of money to refurbish the gallery for the Parthenon sculptures, basically had damaged the sculpture because of a very aggressive cleaning that he instructed them to do, because he was obsessed with the idea of white marble and white statuary. And obviously Pentelic marble is never white, it's not Parian marble, and it has this patina, this honey kind of brown coloration. And then obviously there are accretions, there are there's soot, there is all sorts of deposits over it, and they were basically saying, no, I don't like this doesn't look clean, doesn't look swanky, we just want to brush them off using chisels, using copper wire brushes, and using apparently some acid agents. Now, because of these, obviously, as soon as the British Museum discovered that this was going on, they stopped everything and they tried to put everything hush-hush. In the 90s, this was rediscovered by William St. Clair, who wrote an additional chapter on this damaging cleaning in his second edition of the famous book on Lord Elgin and the marbles. And this basically was the chief argument by the Greeks for saying, yes, you say that you have been caring for them, anything but you actually have been damaging them. Now, this has been the argument by the Greeks ever since, saying you are bad custodians of these, so give them back because we would care for them better than you would, which is wrong under two chapters in a way. One is it is not true, because if you look at the sculptures in Athens, actually they demonstrate a pretty dire history of neglect. The Parthenon sculptures that were on the Parthenon, they were removed only in the early 90s, just under pressure by the international community, because they were just being washed away from by acid rains and by the pollution that was very prominent in Athens, the famous Nephos, this hanging cloud that was forever staying on top of Athens. This was basically creating acid rains with sulfates dissolved into the rain that were basically hitting the marbles, changing these into gypsum, and gypsum was basically being washed away. And so if you look at the marbles in Athens, you see that they are less well preserved. Now there is only additional evidence, as I was saying, from the studies that I mentioned before, because particularly Emma Payne studies the casts that Elgin made of the Elgin marbles of the Parthenon sculpture that remained in Athens, and she compared with 3D scans of both the casts and the original sculptures in the Acropolis Museum. She compared them and say, oh look, they actually the casts look way fresher than what you can measure and scan right now in the Acropolis Museum. So whenever Elgin took the casts, they were in much better shape than they are now. So whenever you say they are looked after in Athens, this is entirely untrue. Also, you can compare the casts that have been made also of these of the Elgin marbles that are in London, and basically you can find out that the presumed aggressive cleaning, it's actually not as aggressive as has been sustained by William Sinclair, and actually it was right what Ian Jenkins was saying, the chief curator for Greece and Rome of the British Museum, when he basically said this has been exaggerated and it's been a dishonest way of handling evidence, both archaeological and documental evidence, by William Sinclair whenever he was drumming up that they had been badly treated and the surface of the marbles had been eroded. This is so wrong that actually the new studies, for example, looking at the statues under infrared spectroscopy, etc., they basically are still finding traces of colors that have been applied on the statues during antiquity, because obviously the statues were painted, and these traces of colors would not have been there if these cleaning operation had been so aggressive as they proclaim it was. So, but this is also, in a way, beyond the point, because in my opinion, this is a mooted argument, because you don't give museum items to a museum just because they care well for them, because otherwise we have to take away all the items from museums in the Near East that are not cared for in a way that we would consider optimal or ideal, and just give them to the Americans just because they have more money to spend on them and they are gonna make a better job. It's all about legitimacy. Do you own these sculptures legitimately? Then you have the right to care for them in the way that you find most appropriate. Yes, there is an element of accountability, there is an element of scientific best practice, but at the end of the day, if you own them, that's your prerogative to choose whatever is the best way of preserving them.
Okay, well, I mean, maybe you could argue that you know, the Greeks wouldn't have taken care of them particularly well through the 19th century or most of the 20th century, but let's forget all that. In 2009, they built a splendid new Acropolis Museum, and I don't think anyone seriously doubts that if the Elgin marbles went back, they would be taken, you know, they would have very good care taken of them in that space. So, and also, you know, when you go to that space, they've taken great care to put it pretty close to the Acropolis, and I actually really enjoy this myself. You go to the top floor, you can see the continuous ionic frieze, you can see some of the metopes, and then you look over, you can have a sight line to the Parthenon itself on the Acropolis. And so this brings us to another argument which Mr. Mitsotakis raised in his recent BBC interview, which is the idea that the sculptures really deserve to be together, right? Phidias, this great sculptor, he oversaw the sculptural program of the Acropolis, of the Parthenon, and they should be seen as this sort of Gesamtkunstwerk, this kind of like complete work of art, right? So are we not, denying people the ability to experience them as one if we don't move them all back to the Acropolis Museum?
There is a series of considerations that I would like to make on these. First of all, the Gesamtkunstwerk that we are talking about, it's actually not the decoration in itself, but it's the decoration plus the temple, because these things are not pretty things that were just sitting on a pedestal in the middle of the Athenian Agora or on the Acropolis. They are sculptural decoration of a building. They make sense only in conjunction with the building. So whenever they say, okay, I want the part in Athens to go with the part in London, and then we have done the totality of the sculptural decoration, and we have reconstituted the unity of the master chief. This is not true, because it's actually three pieces that we need to talk about: the sculptures in Athens, the sculptures in London, and the temple itself. So you would be reconstituting the unity only if you were putting the sculptures back on the temple, which is what was actually recommended by UNESCO whenever Marina Mercuri was advocating for the restitution of the Parthenon sculptures. But it's also what we painfully cannot do anymore because of curatorial considerations. So this is the first thing. The second thing is any visitor of the Acropolis can understand what the decoration looked like, because and especially of the Acropolis Museum now, can understand what the decoration used to look like because of the interesting work that they've done, putting the decorations back together and then in its previous form, developing the frieze the way it was supposed to be on the building itself, and this alternation between originals and casts of the missing part. So any visitor to the Acropolis, whether or not they are original, it doesn't make it doesn't have any particular consequence to the understanding of what did the frieze look like, how big was it, how many figures were there on it, etc. So it's in a way a very weak argument, also because the vast majority of the people that enjoy these friezes are actually not particularly competent when it comes to the finer details of the history, the significance, and the consistency of this sculpture. So at the end of the day, as soon as they get the impression, and they do in the Acropolis Museum, it doesn't make any particular difference to them. Yes, obviously there is a difference between original and copy, and that's why we want to keep the originals of the Elgin marbles in the British Museum, because the original has always had for human beings a power of its own, a magic of its own. But in terms of the understanding, this is not a great argument. You enjoy the Acropolis Museum, and I can see many reasons why. Obviously, one must be excited about a museum that has been finished just in 2007, and why obviously we are implementing all the best practice in there, why the Greeks are investing huge amounts of money to make sure that everything is done as it should, also because the eyes of the international communities are all over the place there. But it is also a very ideological museum, and that's why I don't like it, and that's why I don't want the marbles to get there, because in a way it's an ascientific museum, it's an unscientific museum. We have long decided in the history of ancient art, and in general in the art history progression, that it's not ups and downs, it's not cycles, it's not a parabolic curve where you have a phase of ascension to the peaks, to the acme of art, and then there is a phase of decadence and everything goes goes bad and becomes rotten, etc. This is the way Winkelmann used to look at ancient art. We now know that every single historical phase builds on the previous one, and there is a general progression where the taste mutates and changes and then evolves constantly. So it's more a straight line. Now, what we have in the Acropolis Museum instead is the idea that you actually physically go up, up, and up. You meet the topmost expression of Greek art embodied in the Parthenon frieze, and then you go down and just pass through 4th century, 5th century stuff, and Hellenistic stuff, and then even the Roman and Byzantine stuff, and just go away saying, oh yes, the top of art was actually the Parthenon, and anything else is either preparatory to it, or just they've forgotten about it. They've forgotten about how great they were. Now, this is scientifically wrong. You are teaching people, actually, by having them climb up and then go down that way, you are teaching people something that is wrong. There is another example that I can make, that is the way the caryatids are displayed. If you look at them, they basically made this P-shaped, Greek P-shaped basement pedestal, and then on top of it, they put the 5 caryatids they have, leaving the space for the missing one. Fine. Again, they are making an ideological statement, saying, okay, yes, instead of putting the copy of the caryatid like they did with the frieze, they left intentionally the space void so that people would say, oh, there is one missing here. I didn't know about that. It's in London now. Okay. But also, if you look at the way they are displayed as statues. But the caryatids are not statues. They are architectonical elements. And they are supposed to be understood as elements, as pillars that are supporting an entablature. Where is the entablature? It's not there. Whenever you go to London instead, you see the base, you see the caryatid, and you see a piece of the entablature. That is what obviously Elgin's men removed. But they are displayed in a way where you understand that the caryatid is actually a dressed up column, nothing more than that. It's a way of using a column and basically decorating it in a way that looks like a statue, but it's not. So again, they are displaying archaeological material in a way that not only does not foster, but even prevents the visitor from thoroughly understanding what they are supposed to be, the true essence of the material. So that's why I'm very happy that they built this museum, because obviously they if you remember the old Acropolis Museum from years ago, obviously it was a very cramped space. You could see only a very small portion of the stuff. Now you can see so much more of the Acropolis, so much more of the sculpture of the Acropolis, and the Perser chute, and all the core, all well displayed, etc. All the frontons, there is a wealth in there. But there is also a very clear message that is very ideological, very nationalistic, and that's why I don't see it as conducive to the betterment of the understanding of the Acropolis for the Elgin marbles to go there.
Okay, well, this actually leads me beautifully to the final argument I'm going to throw you. I'm sure you've heard it before, but this is the argument, let's say, from identity or nationhood. And this is the argument that, okay, I mean, Elgin may have had a firman or a copy of a translation of a firman or whatever, and you can argue about property and legitimacy, and you can argue about preservation. But at the end of the day, you know, there were Greeks that made these sculptures, there are Greeks that made the Parthenon, and there's still Greeks today in Athens. And so they're clearly descended from the same people. They speak a version of the same language. And, you know, the Parthenon sculptures, the Elgin marbles were made in Athens. So they should return to Athens, shouldn't they?
No, because the fact that objects move is a sometimes painful part of the reality we as archaeologists face ourselves with, because we see Egyptian obelisks being put in the squares of Rome and Paris, Washington, on the Thames, and we see, for example, entire temples that have been dismantled and remounted in another place, like the temple of Apollo from Eretria that has been been completely dismantled and then mounted in Rome during the time of Augustus next to the theater of Marcellus. It's normal. It's normal for things to move. We know about the horses of San Marco coming from Constantinople and then being put in Venice, and we know about the serpent column from Delphi that instead was brought to Constantinople. So it's the normal part of the historical development that people would just grab stuff from one side and bring it to another for reasons that are eminently cultural, that are symbolic, and that are something that we should apply ourselves at explaining, because they tell us about ourselves and our history, or the history of the people that have performed this movement. Now, instead of understanding this cultural fact, and instead of explaining the historical consequences of this historical action, what the proposal is to say, we're applying a moral judgment that is coming from the 21st century. No, whatever they did in the 18th century, whatever they did in the 5th century, whatever they did in the 12th century was wrong. Therefore, I'm going to make this wrong right by grabbing these things and putting them back in the place where I suppose they do belong. Now, this is, again, a very ideological stance. It's something that is not respectful of the cultural context, is not looking at historical events the way they happened, but is applying our idea of what we would like to have happened, and just changing history and say, even very arrogantly saying, those people that I barely understand, they were wrong. And I, instead, have the perfect knowledge. I know where these things should be, and therefore I grab them and I put them back. Now, as you see, this is something that before we start even thinking about doing, we should explore properly with like congresses and international conventions and all sorts of scientific and public discourse, instead of having some curators acting from some nation, having a piecemeal approach, a case-by-case approach, and looking for win-win solutions and deciding that they want to get together just to grab this item from here and put it there. Because this is not consistent. This is not a principle that can stand against the other principle, the much more widely accepted principle that we should respect history the way it was and not the way we would have liked it to have been. It's sometimes historical events tell us about ourselves in a light that we don't particularly like. But even in those cases, there is value to keeping the traces, the physical embodiments of these events, and let them explain to our modern selves why we were not particularly good or particularly bad. And that's why we don't that's why we, for example, have kept Auschwitz. Auschwitz is the concentration camp of Auschwitz. It's the embodiment of something that we definitely say we don't want to see ever again. And yet we are keeping it. We are not saying this was wrong, therefore let's get rid of the traces. Let's put the terrain in Auschwitz the way it was before the Auschwitz concentration camp was made. Because we say this has something to teach us about ourselves. We should be using as a monumentum. And the monumentum is from Latin monuere. It's something that should admonish us. Now, the Elgin marbles, in a way, even if we don't agree that they should have been put from Athens to London, brought from Athens to London, we should keep them as a monument. We should keep them as an admonishment not to do it ever again. It's still history, it's still culture. And we have no right whatsoever, in my particular view, to just brush away all this history and all this culture and all the consequences, cultural consequences that the marbles have had in London for 200 years and say, this history doesn't matter, I prefer that one because makes the Greeks feel better.
All right, that was great. Thanks so much, Mario. And
it's my pleasure
understand...
as always.
What's that?
It is my pleasure as always.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, you obviously have a wealth of knowledge of the topic. I understand that you're writing a book on the subject.
I am researching a book. It will take some time because obviously I'm doing it part-time. But yes, definitely, I'm very passionate about it, and I think that there are so many facets to this debate. That the argument needs to be explored properly, and the books that have been coming out quite recently, some of them are very bad, like Catherine Titi's one. Some of them are quite good, like Alexander Herman's one. I don't agree with every single page of it, but and I've told Alex, but I definitely like the way he's trying to put the arguments for it and the way he handles the historical evidence. But still, we are not quite there, especially on the cultural aspect of it, the cultural aspect of moving items from one side to another, what this entails, what and why we shouldn't put them back. I think this is something that still needs to be addressed. There was another very good book on this. It was Keeping Their Marbles by Tiffany Jenkins. I want to build on some of her arguments in a way, but adding also my own to the mix.
Great. Okay. Well, people should look out for that. And in the meantime, I'll just thank you once again, Mario. Cheers.